extensive publications and hold numerous academic positions. In addition, somehow she managed to find time to help at our tea house. She narrates tea ceremonies, brings volunteers, and take good care of Japanese exchange students and visiting professors as well. Thank you so much, Professor Dex, for all you do. Please note the audience audio is muted, and please do not use the raise hand feature. You can type questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is also disabled. OK. じゃあ、それではモニカ先生、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much, Masumi, for the kind introduction. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Japan Foundation, as well as the Consulate General of Japan in Detroit, as well as the Saginaw Tea House and Cultural Center for making this wonderful virtual Saginaw Japan Week possible. Also, I would like to thank Scott for all his technical know-how that he brought to this. And I would like to thank our participants today for joining me. This is a basic introduction to the three main Japanese poetic traditions. I will be talking about Tanka or Waka, Renga, and Haiku. So some of you who are already familiar with those poetry traditions, I hope you will still enjoy it. You might have heard about them already. Please feel free to ask me anything at the end of the talk. If there should be any questions to a particular aspect I'm talking about, you can send your question answers via the chat, and I would be happy to answer them as well. Okay. Okay, Japanese poetry is one of the oldest literary genre that we have. And the word for poetry in Japanese is uta, which is interesting because it means both poetry and song. The reason why it has this double meaning goes way back to the Asuka period or the pre-Nara period. We do not know exactly when the first Japanese poetry emerged, but it's generally believed by historians that it comes from the Nara period, especially from the Kojiki or Record of Ancient Matters that was compiled in 712. This is the earliest Japanese foundation history, and it consists of a mythological part where it talks about the creation of the Japanese islands by Izanami and Izanagi, the two great Shinto deities. It talks about the main Shinto kami, Amaterasu, and her relationship as the ancestor of the Japanese imperial line. And it also concludes with stories about the Japanese emperors, the first 33 Japanese emperors. Now, the reason why this work is often cited as the origin of poetry or uta is that it was believed that the Shinto deities spoke in poetic verse. Now, even if you look at the original Japanese version and the English translation, this kind of like poetic verse doesn't really come out very much. Now, the Kojiki, like many of the early works, were only written down many years after these mythological stories originated. So like in many cultures, often song or poetry was the original form of communication, and later it was written down in words. This will become important when we look at the history of poetry, especially later on in the 10th century, in the Heian period, because there will be a reference made back to the power of poetry, and it goes all the way back to the Kojiki. So I will be starting in the Nara period. I already mentioned the Kojiki, but it was not really a purely poetic form of literature. It has both poetry and prose in it. The first real Japanese poetry collection that we have dates back to the Nara period. It's called Manyoshu, or collection of 10,000 leaves. It was compiled in 759 by Otomo no Yakamochi. Now, during the Nara period, Japanese literature in general, especially poetry, because that was the only literature that we really have besides Buddhist texts, is heavily influenced by Chinese literature. So Japanese language itself didn't really have its original writing system until the Heian period. It was mainly an oral language. Then the Chinese characters were introduced to Japan in the early 6th century through Chinese Buddhist monks who brought the Buddhist teachings to Japan. And they would also be the ones who would teach the Japanese aristocratic calligraphers or the emperors how to write the Chinese characters. So in the Nara period, basically literature was based on Chinese poetic tradition. Now, this is often considered to be one of the masterworks of Japanese literature because it's the longest poetry collection. It has 4,500 poems, 20 books. Now, books means literally volumes because during this time period, we don't really have an actual book. We have these hand scrolls or makimono, and they would be unrolled bit by bit, and the people could read the poem and then would be unrolled, and then it would open the next poem. And the categories of poetry were miscellaneous, love, and elegies. Now, among these early traditional poetry patterns, we have the Tanka, the Choka, and the Sadoka, and we also have the haiku. However, the haiku does not really originate in the Manyoshu. It's something that develops in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and we'll talk about this later. The reason why I included it here is because the haiku originates from the Tanka. So what I would like to do, I would like to quickly go through the Tanka, the Choka, and the Sadoka, say what kind of forms of poetry they are, why they were significant, why they continue to exist or didn't continue to exist, and I want to show you some examples. So Tanka, which literally means short poem, ka means poetry, and tan is for short, is the most common form in Japanese poetry, even today. In the Manyoshu, out of all the poems, 4,200 were Tanka. Now, why is Tanka this preferred form of poetry that has lasted from the Nara period to our present time? Because this composition of 5 lines working in a syllabic pattern, 5-7-5-7-7, the first 3 lines kind of introduce the topic and show the development, and the second 2 lines, 7-7, they kind of are the conclusion. It's a couplet that kind of shows what the poem actually said or come up with a conclusion. So the syllabic count only works in the original Japanese. So for those of you who are not familiar with Japanese, it's a polysyllabic language. And I just want to show you how the people would count the sound. So I will read the Japanese poem first, and you can see how the 5-7-5-7-7 syllabic pattern originated. Hodo mo na ku, that's 5. Kumoto narinuru, that's 7. Kimi nareba, that's 5. Mukashi no yume no, that's 7. Kokochi koso sure, also 7. And in English, this Tanka poem means you are gone, transformed in an instant into clouds, and I feel as though in a dream of old. So the poet is saying that his lover, assumingly, is no longer there. We have to assume the person has passed away because transformed in an instant into cloud, and the poet is reminiscently looking back towards the memories he has of this relationship when his lover was still alive. So these kind of love poems are very common in the Manyoshu. The next form of poetry that's common in the Manyoshu, but actually died out after the Manyoshu, that wasn't really used anymore, and today we don't have it existing. It's called a choka. Cho means long and ka is poetry. It's a little bit like in English, an epic poem. These choka usually were telling stories about Korean or Chinese embassies coming to Japan or vice versa. They usually were used for long banquets. So like very much like an epic poem, they have more like a narrative to it. And we have one extremely long choka in the Manyoshu that spans 149 lines. So this one is much shorter, and it reads, however, when I see the leaves upon the autumn hills, my eager hands tremble with the load of crimson leaves, and with reluctance leave the green ones on the boughs. Yes, the green ones are the pity and the autumn hills for me. So again, it's also a love poem. The lover is saying it's autumn. Now, seasons will become a big deal in Heian period poetry. Seasons, nature. In the Nara period, seasons were important as well, but they were mainly used to show the progression of the natural cycle versus the cycle of, which corresponds to the cycle of human life or human existence, kind of working with the time. Later in the Heian period, these words of nature or natural imagery will actually express the emotions of the poet. So autumn is often considered a very sad season because it gets dark very early, it's very cold, long periods of rain, so like the Saginaw weather we have today. And it's usually contrasted with spring, which is the happy period when lovers meet, flowers bloom. So kind of the sad season versus the happy season. So someone is picking up leaves that have changed their colors, and they are very excited when they do this and look at the dark red leaves because they are reminiscing of the spring where the leaves were green and thinking ahead of next spring. So next spring, when again the trees will bloom, my lover will come. So this was also a very typical way of expressing their love poems. And longing is one of the major themes in the Manyoshu. The other poem in the Manyoshu is called Sadoka, or head repeating poem. Now, that is only really visible in the original Japanese because here the syllabic pattern is a little bit different. It's 5-7-7, 5-7-7, and that will repeat as long as it gets. And then the final two lines will be 7-7. Now, this one also occurred in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, as well as the Manyoshu. But today we do not really have many Sadoka. They kind of died out as well. So in this case, we have someone speaking. I have exhausted the strength of my hands weaving this robe for you, my lord. When spring has come, what color would you like me to print and dye it for you? Again, it's a love poem, but it's a little bit different because the poet asks a question at the end of the poem. And there's no answer to it because the lover is nowhere to be seen. So it's assumed that it might be a woman, although some scholars have argued it might also be a man. It's hard to tell, it's an anonymous poem. But let's assume it's a woman. She has woven a piece of clothing, and weaving is a very common occupation for women even today. And she's waiting for her lover to come to show him the robe. And she says, it's almost finished. I just have to dye it. What color should I dye it? She's hoping to hear from him. Now, this kind of question was often used because women and men in the Nara period, even though when they were married, they lived apart. And very often, because Japan was a polygamous society, a man had many women and many mistresses, but a woman only had one man. So sometimes the women would be left days or weeks or even months without a visit from their man. And then they were hoping when the spring comes, the man would come around. So there are quite a few famous poets in the Manyoshu, but one of them stands out, and I want to talk a little bit about him and about his poetry. His name is Kakinomoto no Hitomaru. If you want to become a court poet, and again, all the poets we're going to talk about in the Nara and the Heian period today, we're only talking about the aristocrats. Common people were not really mentioned in the literature at the time because they weren't trained to read and write. It was mainly the aristocrats and the emperor who had the knowledge. So becoming a court poet was part of the examination that they had to do when they became enter the service of the emperor. So besides being familiar with the Chinese classics and passing their bureaucratic exams, knowing about Confucianism, they also had to be distinguished poets because they would be asked by the emperor to compile a poem if a new imperial prince was born, or if someone passed away from the imperial family, or a new emperor ascended the throne, or if there was a foreign embassy visiting the emperor to do a commemorative poem. During the Nara period, there was a lot of traffic between Japan and Korea and Japan and China. That will all change in the Heian period. So writing poems on demands was very common, and Hitomaru was very good at that. But Hitomaru also wrote personal poems or private poems. That was also not uncommon, especially from the Heian period onwards. A lot of famous poets had their own personal poetry collection, and that was very different than the official poems. So for example, in his personal poems, he writes about love poems that he compiled for his wife. So the first poem by Hitomaru was a poem commissioned by the emperor. It was commissioned on behalf of an imperial princess who has passed away. And Hitomaru writes, "So it may well be that grieving beyond measure and moaning like a bird unmated, he seeks your grave each morn. I see him go, drooping like summer grass, wander here and there like the evening star, and waver as a ship wavers in the sea." So it comes out in this poem that the poet expresses the sorrow of the person who's left behind, but he expresses it in a very direct way. He says, grieving beyond measure. Okay, describing that someone is very sad. Moaning like a bird unmated. Okay, if we think about, when we hear the birds during mating season, imagine the cry, seeking someone's grave, going to someone's grave, having their head hang down like summer grasses, and like a ship that has no anchor, that's just drifting within the high waves on the sea. So we do get this idea that someone is grieving. However, it's more descriptive than really emotional, being heartfelt. Now, the next poem is Hitomaru's personal poem, where he expressed his sorrow about his wife. Now, during the Nara period, courtiers often were sent away from the capital. They were sent into the countryside to oversee the provinces, to do some work for the government in the provinces. So usually half of the year they were in the capital, and the other half of the year they would be traveling. Now, when these courtiers were traveling, they didn't take their families with them. The families remained in the capital, kind of as pawn that the man would come back. So on one of these occasions, Hitomaru was told by a messenger, he brought a poem, he said, "We have a poem from the message from the capital, your wife has passed away." And Hitomaru didn't want to believe it. So he compiled a poem. The first part of his poem is kind of looking back at the good times he had with his wife. So he writes, Since in Karo lived my wife, I wished to be with her to my heart's content. But I could not visit her constantly because of the many watching eyes. Men would know of our troth had I thought her too often. When I teach this to my students usually point out, well, how come, people are complaining about this if they were married? How couldn't they see each other? Well, even if you were married, you didn't always live in the same building or the same location together. And it was often considered that women might be distracting the man from their public office. So there were strict rules and regulations how many times you could, see your wife, so you wouldn't do it too much. You wouldn't neglect your official duties. So he's looking back on that. And then he writes, and hoping to hear my grief, even a thousand's part, I journeyed to Karo and searched the marketplace where my wife was wont to go. There I stood and listened, but no voice of her I heard. Though the birds sang in the Onebi mountain, none passed by who even looked like my wife. I could only call her name and wave my sleeve. So at this point, he's very sad, and he's returned to the capital, and he still doesn't want to believe that his wife has passed away. So he goes to the marketplace where she always hung out, and he can't see her. He's looking around, listening to other people, hoping that one of them is his wife, but it's not. She is not there, not to be found. And the last thing he did is wave my sleeve. So the difference in tone between this poem, his private poem, and the previous poem, the official poem, both are poems that express someone grieving, but this is very much more heartfelt. And the key that will be the transition from Nara period poetry to Heian period poetry is this idea of waving the sleeve. Waving the sleeve is what's called a pillow word. Pillow word, or makura kotoba in Japanese. Makura is the pillow, kotoba is the word. And it is actually a word that stands for something else. So Hitomaru is mostly responsible for using a lot of these pillow words that become very popular from the late Nara period onwards. In addition to the pillow word, we also have a place pillow word, utamakura, and a pivot word or pun called kakekotoba, and I will quickly talk about them. So the pillow word, like I said, it stands for something else. So on the one hand, when we say all I could do was wave my sleeve, we imagine a Heian courtier with his gown, literally waving the sleeves. But it also has a second meaning. Waving the sleeve is understood as a sign of affection. Now, this comes from the tradition that Heian women, Nara and Heian period women wore very luxurious kimono. They were often inscribed with a certain pattern. Sometimes they had the family crest on it, so you would know who the woman was. Sometimes they had a certain scent on it. So this is where the idea comes that, the piece of clothing show the affection or show the actual trait of the person. So at the end of the poem, when he writes, I could only call her name and wave my sleeve, this is like his last resort. If you don't answer to this, then I really have to believe that you are gone. Now, the utamakura and kakekotoba, I don't have a poem for that. I will just say like a couple of words. We can talk about those more in the discussion session later on. So, for example, famous places, Mount Yoshino, which is in the Nara region even today. It is the imperial hunting ground in the Nara period, and it also in the spring is a famous place for cherry blossoms even today. So it's a place pillow word because if a poem has Mount Yoshino in it, it usually refers to the cherry blossom viewing. Then the pivot word, that only works in Japanese. It doesn't really work with the English translation. For example, Akashi, it's both a place name, but it can also mean dawn in Japanese. So this was a very brief look at the Nara period. And now we're going to move into the Heian period. The Heian period is often considered the classical period of Japanese literature. A lot of things happen in terms of poetry, but also in terms of other forms like the prose or the women's diary, Nikki Bungaku. Today, I'm just going to focus on poetry. So I mentioned that the Tanka was the predominant form of poetry, 5 lines, 5-7-5-7-7 syllabic pattern that we saw with the Manyoshu in the Nara period. Now in the Heian period, because during this time period, the Japanese developed their own indigenous Japanese writing system called kana or hiragana, they changed the name Tanka because it had this Chinese connection or Chinese connotation, a poem based on Chinese pattern, into Waka. Waka means Japanese poetry. Wa means Japan and ka is poetry. A Waka and a Tanka, they're the same, 5 lines, the same syllabic pattern, 5-7-5-7-7. However, when we talk about Heian period poetry, we exclusively talk about Waka. When we talk about Nara period poetry or present day poetry, we call it Tanka. And the big innovation in Nara period poetry, in Heian period poetry, was to use nature to express emotions. Probably one of the most famous works of Heian period poetry is the Kokin Wakashu, often just called Kokinshu to make it shorter, which translates to collection of poems, ancient and modern, dated 905. It was the first imperially sponsored poetry collection. And I have a little image here. I know this is a very blurry picture, but I just wanted to show this to you. This is part of the Kokinshu, and you can see it's very cursive writing. My students always think it looks messy, but what's interesting here is the background. A lot of Heian period poetry, unlike Nara period poetry, is not written on plain white pieces of paper. It's often very decorative. In this case, we have flowers as the background. Certain flowers represent certain seasons associated with certain feelings. The color of the paper also makes a difference. So in the Heian period, this idea of Waka being, using nature to express the poet's emotion goes far beyond the actual words. It also reaches out into the artistic medium. The Kokinshu is very interesting because it has a preface. Actually, it has 2. It has a Japanese preface and a Chinese preface. The Japanese preface is by the poet Kino Tsurayuki, who is also one of the compilers of the Kokinshu. And I brought only the Japanese preface in today because I want to show you a little bit what it's saying and what this new idea of Japanese poetry was. So this is the Japanese preface to the Kokinshu. Usually a preface is something like an introduction. And in this case, the reason why we have the Japanese preface versus the Chinese preface, it's to distinguish Waka, Heian period poetry, from Tanka, Nara period poetry. So Tsurayuki writes, Japanese poetry has the human heart as seed and myriads of words as leaves. It comes into being when men use the seen and the heard to give voice to feelings aroused by the innumerable events in their lives. The song of the warbler among the blossoms, the voice of the frog dwelling in the water. These teach us that every living creature sings. It is song that moves heaven and earth without effort, steers emotions in the invisible spirits and gods, brings harmony to the relations between men and women, and calms the hearts of fierce warriors. So what is Tsurayuki saying about this new Waka poetry in the Heian period? Well, he says, poetry has the human heart as seed. So meaning the emotions are the essence of a Heian poet. If a poet does not feel anything, he cannot write a poem. That was different in the Nara period, where the poets were given topics and they had to compile something. So for example, if you're a court poet, you had to compile a poem on a certain official occasion, no matter what you felt, and you would write it the best you could. But according to Waka, you really express your feelings. The feelings come first, and then comes the topic. We write about human experiences. That's certainly true. And then it says, the song of the warbler among the blossoms, the frog dwelling in the water, every living creature sings. Now, again, this singing goes back to my first slide where I mentioned that uta means both song and poetry. By saying this, Tsurayuki implies that every creature has the ability to compile poetry. So kind of giving it a universal nature. And then the most important part is in the end here. Song that moves heaven and earth without effort, steers emotion in the invisible spirits and gods. So the invisible spirits and gods is a reference back to the Shinto deities in the Kojiki. The Waka poetry is so powerful that it moves the kami, or the invisible nature spirits in Shinto. That goes back to the idea that both Izanami and Izanagi, as well as Amaterasu and other deities, supposedly spoke in poetic verse in the Kojiki. Harmony to the relations between men and women. Men and women communicated through poetry in the Heian period. And it was a very lengthy exchange of poems back and forth until the first meeting was arranged. So poetry was more than just, a nice form of writing. It was an actual form of communication. And we also had poetry contests in the Heian period. And a person could tell from the calligraphy, from the choice of words, if it was a good poem or not so good. And calms the hearts of fierce warriors. Warriors are usually considered, not really interested in poetry, and they're always considered to be tough and nothing moves them. However, Tsurayuki with this preface implies that Waka poetry is so powerful, it can actually break down that hard shell warrior that usually is not moved by anything because poetry is so beautiful. So we do have the pillar word continuing, the place pillar word, and the pivot word. And one of my personal favorites is the verb play, or engo. Engo literally means word association, en means link, and go means language or word. And it's a verbal play. Now I will show you one of my most favorite poems. It's literally has a theme or a topic that runs throughout the entire poem. However, the actual topic is never really mentioned. The poet mentions certain words that relate to the larger topic, but the actual topic is not really mentioned by words. So, the story goes like this. We have an aristocratic woman who received a poem by one of the men who would like to, have a relationship with her. However, when she receives this poem, she's extremely insulted and she just doesn't want to reply. Now, in the Heian period, if a woman would not reply to a man who sent her a poem, her whole family would be shunned. It would not look very good, and she would be, the main gossip. So she has to reply, but she feels so insulted by this poem that she said, I cannot possibly reply. So she asked her friend Narihira, and that is also was an actual person. His name is Narivara no Narihira. He also has poems in the Kokinshu, and he's also believed to be the hero of the tales of Ise. And he said, okay, I'm going to write an appropriate response for you. So this is what the girl receives from the man. Lost in idle brooding that swells with the long rains, a river of tears that soaks only my sleeves. There is no way to meet you. So the guy is saying, I'm sitting here by myself, I'm lonely, I'm longing for you, I'm crying, and I would love to meet you. And she is just beside her, and Narihira replies, how shallow must be a river of tears that soaks no more than your sleeves. If I hear that you yourself are adrift, I will believe you. So my first question is, what is the angle? What is the word association? We have swells, we have a river of tears, soaking, shallow, river of tears, more soaking, adrift. So in this poem, the word association is water. So the word water is not actually mentioned directly, but we have all these other words that relate to it. It works better in Japanese because nagame, it can be brooding, but it can also be nagai ame or naga ame, long rain. Namida is the tear. Gava is a reading of Kava, river. Namida Gava, the river of tears. Nurite, soaking. Asami, shallows of a river. Hizurame, soaking. And Nagaru, to drift. So in the Japanese, it works even more powerful because we have this double meaning of this angle. So what is it about this poem that Our Lady didn't like? Why was she so offended? Well, the guy said, oh, I cried. My sleeves are soaked. That means the long sleeves of his kimono. And she says, well, you can't be serious, dude. If you really care about me, if you're really serious, then you have to cry more. You didn't cry enough. You have to cry so your entire kimono is soaked. You are drowning in your own tears. So that's why she says, how shallow must be a river of tears that soaks no more than your sleeves. So she is complaining that he is not serious enough because only the sleeves are wet, but she would like him to be completely drenched in his tears. I think it's a great poem. And then we also have female poets. Unfortunately, due to the time constraint today, I only brought one in. She's very famous. Her name is Onomachi. And she probably got famous from a poem that she wrote towards the end of her life. It reads, the cherry flowers have faded here in the realm of mortality, here in the weary realm. It relates to the fact that Onomachi used to be a very beautiful court poetress. She also has poems in the Kokinshu. However, later on in life, she somehow lost this ability to write poetry. And of course, she aged like all human beings, and she wasn't so beautiful anymore. So she was looking back, using the cherry flowers, which are always indicative of beautiful young women. They have faded. The realm of mortality, the weary rain. Again, rain is a sad item, usually coupled with autumn or getting old or the end of a life. So it's actually a very sad poem. And I can talk about Onomachi a little bit later. There are some legends why that might have happened, but she's a very problematic figure, but also a very interesting one. So these are two poems from the Heian period, and I think you can see how nature is used very differently to show the emotions of the poet than it was in the previous Nara period. It's more effective, more appealing, more sensory, versus in the Nara period, the feelings were more described. And that has to do because that's how it was in Chinese poetry, very descriptive, versus Waka poetry is very interpretive, very sensory. Now, linked to the Tanka or Waka poetry is another genre that became popular in the 14th and 15th century. That is called Renga or linked verse. It has the same pattern as both the Tanka and the Waka, 57577. What is different is that Renga is a, if you want to call it, a group poem. A Renga poem is always written by two people or more. So in most cases, the first poet would write the first 3 lines, so they would get a topic, and then the second poet would write the second 2 lines. So it's compiled by 2 different people. They write about the same topic, but as with all things human beings are involved, we all have different opinion, different association with certain things in life. So if it's summer, one person might be talking about, taking the boat out on the lake. Another one would be writing about beautiful summer sunsets. For this one, I brought in one of the most famous Renga poets. There were actually 3. The first, his name is Sogi. Then we have Shohaku and Socho. And actually, they are all 3 in this poetry contest. It's called the 3 Poets of Minase, or the Minase 3 Poetry Contest. It's, if you look this up, it's one of the most popular Renga poetry contests. So, Sogi writes, "As it snows, the base of the mountain is misty this evening." So these are the first 3 lines of a regular Waka poem. And then Shohaku writes the last final lines. "Far in the way the water goes, a plum blossom smelling hamlet." The next 3 lines by Socho. "The wind from the river sways weeping willows. Now it's spring." And then Sogi writes, "The pole of a boat makes a clear sound at dawn." Then Shohaku writes, "The moon must be visible even in a foggy night." And Socho completes, "Frost on the field, autumn at its end." So if we look at the poem, the topic is seasons or seasonal change. So the first poet starts by saying it is winter. "As it snows, the base of the mountain is misty this evening." Then the next person talks about plum blossom. Plum blossoms are indicative of spring. So we have this change from winter into spring. Now the next poet also writes about spring, but he actually uses the word. So he says, "The wind from the river sways weeping willows into spring." And then the next person talks about going out on the boat. Then we have the moon, and that's probably the summer. And then we have the autumn. So it's a progression, both in terms of seasonal progression, in terms of progressions of the individual poets, because each poet writes about a different season or a different aspect of the season. So this is what a Renga poem would look like. And lastly, because I'm almost out of my time, because I want to leave some time for discussion, haiku poetry. Now, haiku poetry is probably most familiar to everyone. The person who really brought haiku poetry to life was Matsuo Basho. The interesting part is that haiku poetry originated from Renga poetry. Haiku only have 3 lines. Renga poetry and Waka and Tanka have 5. So a haiku poem is actually the first 3 lines of a Tanka or a Waka poem. Haiku is very different in language and topic than any of the previous poetry discussed today, because it is written for the common people. It became popular in the 16th and 17th century, so Edo period, a time where the middle class or the commoners, especially merchant class, also were able to get an education. Prior to the Edo period, it was mainly the upper class who were literate. So these kinds of haiku poems often embody comedy or satire. The language is very simple, and they depict everyday life. So usually people think it's super easy to read and analyze a haiku poem. Well, let's see. Basho, interestingly, he came from a samurai family, but he didn't follow his father's footstep. He was actually traveling a lot when he was younger, and he was trained in both the Chinese and the Japanese classics. And he was the one who made haiku poetry famous. There are two poems, but this is probably the most famous one by Basho. So you see 3 lines. These would be the first 3 lines of a Waka poem. It reads, "An ancient pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of the water." Okay, if we look at the poem, we said, oh, that's easy. We understand everything, super easy language, very simple. The question is, what does it mean? And the answer is, nobody knows. Introducing haiku poems and analyzing them is very, very difficult. One thing that we know, because there are many possibilities of interpreting it, one thing that all haiku poems have in common is that we have a change occurring. The first line and the third line, there is always some kind of contrast. And it's usually the second line that implies a change. So when we think an ancient pond, it could literally be an ancient pond, or it could be something from the past that has remained untouched, pure, not disturbed. And if we look at the last line, the sound of the water. So I always imagine going to the lake and skipping stones or something, or hearing the waves of the ocean. So this is a strong contrast, absolutely quiet, something old, untouched, quiet, pure, and now something is moving. The frog jumping in implies this change. Something has jumped or has disturbed this ancient pond, and now we have a movement of the surface. We are hearing the water. Most scholarly interpretations about this poem usually say that it has to do, because a lot of Basho's poetry has political commentary. So Basho was maybe longing for something from the past. He wasn't satisfied with the Edo period shogunate. The Tokugawa period or Edo period was a very difficult time. The country was closed in. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the shogun in charge, had very strict social rules. So it could be looking back at a previous peaceful time. It got disturbed. Maybe something happened in the government or a war happened. And now we have a new situation. So these are possible ways of reading these haiku poems. Then we have this one, which is maybe a little bit easier. The students usually like this one very much. Things spoken turn lips cold, the autumn wind. Things spoken, words you say to someone, turn lips cold. So kind of in English, we say to give someone the cold shoulder or turn someone the cold shoulder, right? So you say something and that causes a problem in the relationship, or friends, don't talk to each other anymore. So you hurt someone with words. The autumn wind is a cold thing, autumn, the sad season. The autumn wind reinforces this kind of separation between people because of what was said. So again, this could be that someone, hurt a friend or a family member, or someone spoke out against, the government, and that caused a revolt or some kind of problem, and then the people are not communicating anymore. Okay, I will stop here since I want to allow some time for questions. Okay, no questions so far. I hope everyone is still there. If you do have a question, please type it in the Q&A section. One was answered. Okay, okay. So there's a question by Masumi. Makura kotoba, why do you call it Makura? Yeah, that is a question, very well asked question. The pillow word. Now, in English, we have something like a metaphor, something that stands for something else. It's not quite sure why it's a pillow word, but usually, because these are love poems. So one argument is like in the love poem, the pillow represents something personal. We don't have many pillow words that are not related to love poems or lovers' feelings. So I think the reason why it might be called Makura Kotoba is because it's very personal and it relates to love poems. Okay. Yes. Matsu Basho, he has a collection of his haiku poetry. I'm not sure if it has a name, but in addition to haiku poems, the other thing that Matsu Basho is famous for, it's called Oko no Hoso Michi, or the narrow road to the deep north. This is a travel diary. Towards the end of his life, Matsu Basho made a long journey from the capital of Edo all the way to Otsu, which is in the Lake Biwa region. And he came across places where previous Heian Period people or Heian Period poets stopped. So he would go to the famous places and he would compile haiku. So it was all on foot. It's written in something called haibun. It's a combination between haiku poetry and prose, haibun-like prose. And basically he starts this, it has a very strong Buddhist influence, this diary as well. He starts by saying, I'm setting out on this journey and I don't know if I will, even make it or even return. Then he's lamenting in a lot of haiku poems about his departure. He gets a lot of gifts from his friends. And then he lays out every day where the journey takes him in a very poetic way. Yeah. So that's called Oko no Hoso Michi, or the narrow road to the deep north. How many haiku poems did Matsu Basho write? I'm not sure, but I think it's at least 1,000. It's a very large number. Any other questions?
Monika, you have 2 questions in the Q&A section.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm very sorry. Okay. Okay. Mark has one. The Tanka and haiku really only work in Japanese. Well, the haiku, you mean the counting? Okay. Do you mean the syllable counting, Mark? If you want to count the syllables 5, 7, 5, 7, 7, that only really works in the Japanese. But a haiku is derived. Yeah, the syllabic count only really works in Japanese. Okay. And then Natsuo Yoba asked, do you write Japanese poems? If so, is that haiku, waka, or both? Oh no, I'm not a poet. I wish I would be. I love to read Japanese poetry, but I myself do not write any poetry. Okay, do we have anything else? Okay, Mari Suzuki asked a great question. Do you have your opinions or explanation about Manyosho and relationship of Korean words, which were the popular idea sometime? Yeah, I do not, and I'm not a Manyosho specialist. I'm actually a Heian and Kamakura period specialist. If you want someone who works on Manyosho and its relationship to Korean language, what's the person's name? He's at the university. I'm going to write this down. He's at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His name is, at least he used to be there when I was there, Sasha Vovin. And he is a person who's done a lot of work on Manyosho and Korean language. If you look up Sasha Vovin, either he's still in Hawaii or he has changed institution, but he's a person who has worked on this relationship. I'm interested in, like in general, like because I also teach Japanese language at SVSU. That's my main teaching point, even though my training is in literature, about the grammar and relationship, but it's in modern Japanese to Korean. But I don't do any ancient Korean and ancient Japanese. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monika. Monika 先生、どうもありがとうございました。
どういたしまして、私も感謝しています。
So this completes our digital Saginaw Japan Week. I'd like to again thank the Japan Foundation's Center for Global Partnership for generous funding and the Japanese consulate in Detroit for technical support that made this event possible. If you've missed videos or webinars, they will be available through the center's YouTube channel. Again, thank you, everyone. We hope to see you in person someday, and please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.